Hi there. You're listening to English Podcast for Beginners, your friendly guide to learning English step by step. Let's learn, practice, and grow together.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, the place where we turn stacks of sources, research, and expert notes into genuinely actionable intelligence and those really satisfying aha moments that can change how you approach things. Today, we are tackling a problem that I guarantee affects every single one of you, no matter what you're trying to master. It's that thick, heavy blanket of informational overload. You know the feeling, you're motivated, you're totally committed, you've, cleared your calendar, you bought the textbooks, but instead of getting clarity and progress, you just feel stressed, confused, and just completely exhausted.
Yeah, the desire is there, but the actual effort feels like you're swimming through heavy mud.
Exactly. And it's so frustrating because, by all the external metrics, you're doing the work. You are putting in the hours, but you're getting these, diminishing returns.
It's the central paradox of intense study, isn't it? We start out with so much enthusiasm, and we believe that just sheer, brute force effort is going to carry us to mastery.
Right.
And then we find out that the very act of trying too hard becomes this huge psychological and even physical barrier that just shuts down the whole learning process.
Wow.
Our source material for this deep dive it's fascinating because it takes these universal strategies from a very specific context, which is optimizing study habits for intense English language learning.
Okay.
But as we unpack it, you're going to see these principles apply perfectly to, anyone trying to tackle organic chemistry or master a complex financial modeling software or even prepare for a grueling certification exam. It's all the same brain.
That's exactly right. And that's our listeners' mission today. It's highly focused.
Yeah.
We need to quickly gain a thorough, a structural understanding of these anti-burnout strategies.
We're looking for the levers.
The levers, yes. The psychological and the practical shifts that we can actually pull to transform that continuous study from a punishment into an enjoyable, stress-free journey. We really want to extract those core insights about effective habits that let the effort compound instead of just crashing.
And we have to start by defining the enemy. Our sources, they detail this feeling very clearly. You're studying every single day, you're consuming massive amounts of information, you're watching videos, trying to remember hundreds of new facts.
The fire hose.
The fire hose, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And then it feels like without warning, you just hit a wall.
Yeah.
You feel intensely tired, your concentration just poof, evaporates, and you completely lose your motivation. That feeling, the one that just halts the whole journey, that is precisely what we call learning burnout.
Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly is burnout in a learning context compared to, just being sleepy or a bit frustrated? Because if I'm reading a really dense topic for an hour, I expect to be mentally tired.
And that's a key distinction. Simple fatigue is, physical or mental exhaustion that a good night's sleep is going to resolve. But learning burnout, as it's defined in these materials, is a much deeper psychological and structural problem.
So it's not just about sleep.
Not at all. It's clearly defined as feeling tired, stressed, or confused because you're studying too much without enough rest or, and this is key, studying in the wrong way. The immediate core lesson here, the necessary shift in perspective is that this feeling is common. It's universal. And most importantly, it does not mean you are inherently bad at the subject.
That's a huge relief to hear, I'm sure.
It means your methodology is flawed. It's a structural failure in the architecture of your study approach. It's just become unsustainable.
So we're not looking for some magic pill to boost our internal drive. We're looking for a healthier, more intelligent way to apply the motivation we already have so it doesn't self-destruct.
Precisely. We're moving from a scarcity mindset, this idea that effort has to be, squeezed into these intense bursts, to an abundance mindset where sustained, low-resistance effort is actually the key to getting somewhere fast.
I like that.
Our mission today is to extract their specific strategies that transform study from something heavy and punitive into something enjoyable, continuous, and therefore, successful.
Yeah.
We're going to deconstruct this myth of the learning marathon.
And replace it with what? The power of the intelligent sprint.
The power of the intelligent sprint, exactly.
Let's start right at the source of the problem then, that feeling of stalled progress. When the sources detail the symptoms of learning burnout, they list the obvious ones, tiredness, boredom, frustration. But the most, I guess, insidious symptom they highlight, the one that really kills motivation, is feeling that your improvement has completely stalled even when you're studying a lot of hours.
That sense of stalled progress despite high effort, that right there, that's the core psychological trap.
How so?
Well, it's that moment when the learner feels utterly justified in thinking, I just have to push harder, when in reality, the exact opposite is true.
It's counterintuitive.
Totally. I mean, if you're pushing a huge vehicle up a steep hill and it stalls, what's your instinct?
To strain more, rev the engine harder, give it everything I've got.
Exactly. But in cognitive work, that instinct usually leads to immediate burnout and a total system collapse. You've hit a capacity limit you can't just motor through.
So it's the definition of the learning treadmill. You're running hard, the effort gauge is pinned, but you look up and realize the landscape hasn't changed at all. And that has to lead to self-doubt.
It leads to a brutal, self-reinforcing spiral. The learner, they internalize this failure and they think, my capacity is too low, or I must not be working hard enough.
When the reality is something else entirely.
The reality is that the brain is simply hitting its processing limit. We need to explain this using the concept of cognitive load.
Okay, break that down for us.
When you force intense, continuous input like trying to absorb 50 complex new terms in 90 minutes, you are overloading your working memory. You're essentially pouring a 5-gallon bucket of new information into a tiny 1-gallon cup.
And as you keep pouring, the excess knowledge, it doesn't get integrated. It just spills out unused, leaving you exhausted and frustrated.
And that frustration, that confusion, is a biological signal. It's your brain screaming for a break. The analysis point here is crucial. High effort can actually become an inhibitor if it's sustained in the wrong way.
So feeling bored, tired, frustrated,
Yeah.
these aren't signs of, moral weakness.
Not at all. They are explicit biological signals that your current approach to cognitive load is unsustainable. And if you ignore those signals, you don't just stop learning, you start to actively resent the subject. And that's where motivation completely dies.
So this brings us to what the sources call the central rule, the single most important structural change you can make. Longer does not always mean better.
This is the revolutionary mindset shift.
Yeah.
It really is. We are so culturally conditioned to revere the grind, the image of the student locked in the library for 8 hours straight, sustained only by sheer willpower.
Yeah, we see it in movies, we hear it everywhere. No pain, no gain.
Right. But this cultural reverence is actively counterproductive to how the human brain actually processes and encodes complex information into long-term memory.
But I know our listeners probably thinking, wait a second, if I'm prepping for a major exam like the MCAT or the bar, I have to log those hours. If I'm not spending 8 hours studying, how can I possibly pass?
And the answer lies in the quality of those hours, not the clock time. Biologically, the brain needs time to rest and process information. We often make the mistake of viewing rest as a pause from learning.
Like it's a luxury.
A luxury, exactly, something we indulge in after the hard work is done. But structurally, rest has to be integrated as a necessary, active, and absolutely essential part of the learning cycle itself.
I think that reframing is worth repeating. Rest isn't laziness, it's cognitive consolidation. It's when the actual, learning transformation happens.
We can tie this right back to the work on synaptic plasticity and memory formation. When you acquire new, raw data, say reading a technical article or watching an intense lecture, you create these temporary, very volatile neural connections.
Okay.
You can think of them like wet clay. They're fragile. The brain then has to index, file, and strengthen these connections, turning them into solid, long-term memory structures.
And that filing process, that's where rest comes in.
That complex filing process happens most efficiently when the brain is in a less active, focused state, during breaks, during light activities, and most crucially, during deep sleep.
So if I study intensely for 3 hours straight without a break, the second half of that block is inefficient or even wasted.
That's a great way to put it. Your brain is spending so much energy just trying to hold all the new information that it doesn't have the bandwidth to properly index and store the data from the first hour. The backlog becomes the barrier.
So it's not just about getting tired, it's an actual processing bottleneck.
That's the essence of the problem. If you force continuous input without rest, you create a situation that psychologists call proactive interference, where the new information is actively disrupting the old information from being encoded properly.
Which is why the sources are so emphatic that short and regular study sessions are far more effective than long and tiring ones.
Far more effective.
Let's put a number on it then. Instead of forcing a 3-hour block, what does the research suggest is, a better way?
Well, you can look at models like the 90-20 model or the principles behind the Pomodoro method. The idea is a focused sprint followed by a real break.
So, like an hour of high focus.
An hour of highly focused work followed by a proper 15 to 20-minute break where you genuinely rest your mind. And that means you stand up, you move, you look away from the screen, maybe you listen to some music. That single hour is exponentially more productive than trying to grind for an hour and 15 minutes with diminishing returns.
Because the brain just can't maintain that peak function for that long.
It can't. That third hour of grinding feels so heavy because you're trying to use a high-speed processor that is desperately signaling it needs to cool down.
This really emphasizes the value of focus over sheer endurance. If I know my study block is only 30 or 40 minutes, I'm far more likely to be truly present, minimize distractions, and maximize the quality of that brief, intense input.
And this implicitly supports another powerful learning technique known as spaced repetition.
Right.
By studying in these short, regular bursts, you are naturally spacing out the retrieval and the encoding practice. Each time you come back to the material after a break, your brain has to work just a little bit harder to retrieve the information.
And that little struggle is a good thing.
That small, productive struggle is what strengthens the memory trace far more than just continuous, exhaustive review. Trying to cram 50 new facts at once just overwhelms your short-term working memory, which makes retention weak and triggers that specific feeling of being confused and frustrated.
So the first major structural change for our listener, whether they're learning vocabulary or vehicle dynamics, is recognizing that if you feel tired, stressed, or like your progress has stalled,
The answer isn't to push for a fourth hour.
it's to radically shorten the session and insert a period of genuine mental rest.
Treat mental rest as mandatory, scheduled processing time. I mean, you wouldn't run a complex data center without a scheduled cooling period, right? The processors would overheat and crash. Your mind is the ultimate processor, and skipping rest is simply skipping the necessary processing steps.
Respect the brain's biological limits.
If you respect them, your brain will reward you with stronger retention and zero burnout.
That structural shift in timing leads us perfectly into the psychological side of consistency. Because even with perfectly timed sessions, timing alone isn't going to work if the goal we're aiming for is just impossible.
Exactly.
So let's pivot now to how we manage our ambition so it actually fuels us rather than crushing us. Our sources introduce this necessity of setting realistic goals.
And this is where we shift from managing fatigue to managing motivation itself. Because burnout isn't only physical exhaustion, it is profoundly the exhaustion of the will. The motivation just runs dry because the reward system completely breaks down.
And to feel motivated, learners need to feel like they're moving forward.
Constantly. Otherwise, the effort just feels pointless.
Let's look at the core example our sources provide. It's tailored to language learning, but it's so clear. Contrasting the massive, unrealistic goal of learning 50 new words in one day versus a realistic goal of, say, 5 or 10 words.
The contrast is purely psychological. When a learner sets an impossibly large goal like 50 words, or finishing 3 chapters of dense material in a day, they start the day already anticipating failure.
Or at best, anticipating a grueling, painful process.
Exactly. The sheer scale of the task breeds resistance. And crucially, even if they achieve a very respectable 35 words, their brain still registers that day's activity as a failure because they fell short of the arbitrary maximalist target they set.
And that feeling of failure, even just partial failure, it releases discouraging hormones like cortisol, which acts like a powerful brake on any future attempts. It basically teaches the brain that this activity is associated with pain and inadequacy.
You're spot on. The reason the small goal is so superior is dead simple. It's easier to reach. And that ease is the single most critical factor for sustaining motivation over the long haul.
So when you set out to learn just 5 or 10 words, and you achieve those 10 words,
You activate the reward center in your brain. Your brain releases those necessary neurochemicals, dopamine and endorphins, the ones associated with success and achievement. That small, tangible, and highly reliable reward becomes the engine of your continued momentum.
I can see how that mechanism connects the dots. If yesterday's study session was a defined, concrete win, I'm much more likely to approach today's session with enthusiasm and low resistance.
Rather than with that heavy dread of anticipated failure.
Exactly.
This is the fundamental psychological mechanism at work here. Success, even small defined success, is the most powerful fuel for continuous motivation. By making the goal easily achievable, you guarantee a tangible reward, which reinforces the effort for the next session. And this proactively prevents that overwhelming feeling that is the psychological precursor to quitting.
It's interesting how often we confuse raw ambition with effective planning. We think setting a massive goal demonstrates high ambition.
Right. I'm going to conquer this whole textbook by Friday.
But if that goal is unattainable in a sustainable way, it just becomes a sophisticated, self-sabotaging mechanism. I do want to challenge that a little bit, though. For someone who is truly ambitious, doesn't setting a low goal like 5 words feel, well, underwhelming?
That's a valid point, and it's why we have to decouple our long-term ambition from our daily execution. Your overall ambition should be huge. I want to master this field. I want to write the greatest code. I want to ace this exam.
Okay.
But the daily execution must be tiny, measurable, and above all, highly achievable. You should be aiming for a 90% or even 100% success rate on your daily task. Think of it like compounding interest for your motivation.
So a reliable 10% gain every single day
Is infinitely better than a massive 70% gain followed by a 4-week burnout-induced crash where you do nothing.
The small win is sustainable and it's non-threatening. It kind of removes that decision paralysis of where to even start.
Precisely. If I sit down and stare at a massive goal, I feel overwhelmed, and I might delay starting for hours. But if I sit down and know my job is simply to find 5 specific pieces of data, the resistance to starting drops to almost zero.
Okay, let's provide the practical translation that our learner needs.
Okay.
The sources use language learning as the foundation, so how do we apply this concept of small, realistic goals to other non-linguistic subjects? What does it look like when you're tackling a dense technical manual or a complex historical period or a challenging section of advanced math?
The principle is always to define your daily goal by completeness and mastery, not by raw scope or time spent.
Okay, give me an example. The technical manual.
Okay, the massive, intimidating goal is read and understand Chapter 5 on advanced system integration. That's just amorphous and scary.
So the realistic small goal has to be super specific, with the definitive ending.
Yes, it becomes perfectly summarize the 3 main functions of component X, which are covered in the first 2 pages of the chapter, and then be able to diagram their interaction from memory without looking at the book.
Ah, that's a small, bounded goal.
It's small. It involves reading, synthesis, and active retrieval, but it's bounded. When you close the book, you can definitively say, I mastered that single concept today. That's a win.
That shifts the focus dramatically. It moves from time spent, I studied for 3 hours, to actual knowledge acquired. I learned one concept fully.
Another example, if you're tackling a new coding language, instead of trying to build a whole functional application, the small goal could be successfully implement one new type of function, let's say a recursive function, and run a series of 10 test cases to prove it returns the correct output every time.
The feeling of closure is really important there.
It's vital. When the task is complete, you can mentally file it as done, and that frees up your cognitive space.
And for something like history or the humanities, where the task is often just reading massive volumes of text.
Break it down by synthesis, not by pages. So instead of read 50 pages, the small goal becomes read the article on the Treaty of Westphalia and write 3 clear bullet points articulating how this treaty shifted the concept of state sovereignty in Europe.
You're forcing a small, defined act of production which confirms mastery, instead of just passive consumption, which can feel endless.
And crucially, that feeling of achievable closure reinforces the idea that you do not need to try to learn everything at once. You are essentially training your brain to trust the process, that mastery will come incrementally, not instantaneously.
If the brain knows it only needs to exert intense focus for 30 minutes to get a defined, concrete win, it approaches that task with less resistance and higher energy.
But if it anticipates 8 hours of amorphous, exhausting effort, it will engage every psychological defense mechanism it has to avoid starting. Small goals are the gateway to consistency, and consistency is the only reliable long-term cure for burnout.
So these 2 sections really work in tandem then. Those short, regular sessions provide the biological capacity and focus.
And the small, achievable goals provide the essential psychological fuel and reward. You absolutely need both to maintain velocity. Without both, the engine just sputters. You either run out of fuel, your motivation, or you burn out the engine, your cognitive capacity.
Okay, so we've established the right timing blocks and the right goal size. Now, we have to talk about keeping the spirit alive, because even perfectly sized sessions can become agonizing if you're just repeating the same activity endlessly.
The monotony.
Our sources highlight this profound risk of monotony. If you only study grammar, you may feel bored. It seems simple, but it's huge.
Boredom is a silent, insidious killer of motivation. It doesn't show up as, loud frustration right away. It manifests as mental drift, restlessness, procrastination, and then eventually total avoidance.
If the process is predictable and repetitive,
The brain automatically switches to a low engagement setting, which just kills retention.
so the core solution proposed is variety. Discussing the necessity of mixing up different skills and activities is essential for avoiding that psychological fatigue, or what we might call task burnout.
Variety acts like a cognitive circuit breaker or a neurological reset button. Our brains don't actually get tired of working. They get tired of using the exact same cognitive circuits over and over again.
That's a really interesting distinction.
Think about it.
Yeah.
If you spend an hour intensely focused on analytical left brain tasks, say solving complex differential equations, and then you switch immediately to a creative verbal right brain task like drafting a persuasive summary of your findings.
You're engaging entirely different parts of the brain.
Exactly, different neurological circuits. So you aren't taking a true mental break, but you are resting the circuit that was just heavily engaged.
That is a phenomenal insight. It explains why a 2-hour block devoted entirely to memorizing definitions feels like absolute agony.
Yeah.
But 2 hours split between memorizing, then doing application problems, then maybe watching a video explanation, that feels productive and manageable.
And the source material provides specific examples tailored to language learning that we can absolutely generalize. They list things like listening to podcasts, watching short videos, reading simple articles, or speaking out loud.
We can probably categorize those into modes, right? Like analytical work, receptive input, and active production.
That's a perfect way to frame it. So let's translate those categories for our generalized learner. Analytical work is your problem solving, your critique, your deep thinking tasks.
Active production would be things like writing code, drafting an essay, or creating flashcards, anything where you're making something.
Right. And then there's receptive input.
Which is what exactly?
That's the low stress consumption of information. Reading a simple exploratory article about the subject's application in the real world, listening to an audio lecture, or watching a short engaging documentary. The goal is just exposure, not immediate performance or analysis.
And the key insight here is that this variety maintains interest, and it prevents the study session from feeling heavy and monotonous. It feels less like a single, grueling, continuous task and more like circuit training for your brain.
This oscillation is fundamental for sustainability. If you only do high-effort analytical tasks, you burn out your processing centers rapidly. But if you only do low-effort input, you don't synthesize or retain the information effectively, and that leads to the frustration of stalled progress.
So variety is the schedule manager that makes sure both are integrated without inducing a mental collapse.
Exactly.
Now let's dedicate some serious time to what I think is the true silver bullet strategy for managing fatigue, the specific power of listening practice. Our sources state that listening practice is especially useful when you feel tired.
This point is so powerful, and it's often missed by those highly driven learners who think productivity just means output, output, output.
Yeah, if I'm not writing or solving, I'm not learning.
Right, that's the misconception. The material clearly highlights the core advantage. Listening is a fundamentally low-pressure activity because the learner does not need to write or think too hard.
But I need you to break down the mechanism there. Why does the tired brain tolerate listening when it, completely refuses to cooperate with reading a textbook?
It all comes back to the hierarchy of cognitive functions. When you are genuinely tired, your executive function, that's the prefrontal cortex stuff responsible for critical analysis, detailed planning, judgment, complex motor tasks like writing or coding, that is severely depleted.
It's running on empty.
Totally. So asking a tired brain to write a comprehensive summary or solve a difficult calculation is asking for peak performance from a depleted resource. And that creates massive internal resistance.
But the receptive pathways in the brain are still functioning.
Exactly. The input pathways, particularly for auditory information, which is continuous and temporal, they can still function reasonably well even when the system is low on power. By switching to listening, you drastically reduce the cognitive burden of production and intense analysis, while still ensuring the material is being introduced, or at least reinforced, in your system.
You're transitioning from an active demanding mode to a receptive passive one.
And you are still absorbing the rhythm, the context, the core terminology, and the structure of the subject matter all, without that immense energy-intensive effort of retrieving information from long-term memory or physically writing a response.
And the genius, the expert context here, shows the practicality of it. Listening can happen while walking, resting, or doing light activities.
This shifts learning from a fixed, intense activity, the dedicated desk session, to a flexible, integrated background process.
So if you're learning about complex historical movements, this could be a high-quality historical podcast while you walk the dog.
Or if you're learning technical theory, it could be an explanatory video or an audiobook playing at a slightly faster speed in the background while you cook dinner.
This allows for continuous learning without scheduling stress. It ensures the input is happening without the intense cognitive burden of production. It helps the knowledge improve naturally without pressure. It obviously feels like I'm hacking my way to an extra 2 hours of study time without any of the fatigue.
That's precisely what you are doing. It's strategic efficiency. The brain is constantly building patterns. When it is highly stressed, it focuses only on the immediate analytical task.
Tunnel vision.
Right. But when it's relaxed and it's receiving background input, it starts building subconscious connections. It recognizes patterns, it familiarizes itself with terminology, and it improves its structural comprehension of the topic, all without the pressure of having to perform.
It's like immersion.
It is the neuro-linguistic reason why language learners benefit so much from immersion. It's that 247 background hum of the subject matter.
So the message is, don't just collapse when you feel tired. Transition.
Yes. Shift from high-effort production to low-effort reception. That transition is the anti-burnout mechanism. It democratizes the learning process. It moves skill acquisition out of the rigid, formal structure of the study hall and into the flexible, fluid, and enjoyable parts of your daily life. This is the clearest possible reinforcement that learning is a continuous journey, not just a painful, scheduled event.
Okay, we've covered timing, goals, and activity variation. We've established the structural fixes. Now we have to tackle the deepest internal roadblock, the psychological pressure that fuels the most intense burnout of all, the relentless pursuit of perfection.
Oh, this is a big one.
Our sources address this debilitating stress felt by so many learners who want perfect English, or, in our generalized context, want perfect mastery, flawless execution, and zero mistakes from day one.
Perfectionism is the single greatest enemy of continuous motion. It truly is. It creates this brutal internal critic that just punishes any effort that falls short of an unrealistic, often impossible ideal.
And that internal critic is the voice that says, don't submit that code, it's not elegant enough,
Or don't try to speak that foreign language until you know the perfect grammar. It's paralyzing.
So the key mindset shift proposed in the material is, well, it's revolutionary for a lot of high-achieving learners who tie their self-worth to error-free output. Mistakes are a normal part of learning.
And this needs to be viewed not as some comforting platitude, but as a profound piece of diagnostic analysis. Every mistake should be reframed as a step forward.
A step forward.
A mistake is not an error, it is data. It tells you exactly which boundary you just pushed, where your knowledge system broke down, and precisely where the reinforcement needs to happen. I mean, if you didn't make mistakes, you would have no reliable map of where your weak points are.
I sometimes think that if you aren't actively making mistakes, you aren't actually trying hard enough. You're just staying strictly within your established comfort zone, just repeating what you already know.
That's the liberating effect of accepting mistakes. When you view mistakes as necessary input, as information that guides your next study move, rather than as evidence of your inadequacy, learning immediately becomes easier and less stressful.
And this acceptance is critical for that continuous momentum we keep talking about.
Because it drastically lowers the bar for starting the next activity. The anxiety of failure is what causes procrastination. If imperfection is welcome, you can start right now, imperfectly, and gain immediate data.
This reframing allows the focus to be entirely on the process, that iterative cycle of attempt, failure, correction, refinement, rather than on the impossible outcome of immediate flawlessness.
The goal shifts from the crushing pressure of I must be flawless to the sustainable reality of I must iterate quickly. An iteration is inherently messy, sometimes it's ugly and often frustrating, but is the only viable path to mastery. This mindset shift is arguably the deepest anti-burnout strategy of all because it just disarms the internal anxiety that accompanies intense study.
You stop viewing learning as a performance.
And you start viewing it as an exploration.
And finally, we have to wrap back around to the most critical component that integrates all of these strategies, mandatory rest. The sources reiterate this as the final, crucial step: remember to rest.
And we have to vehemently challenge the traditional view held by so many high achievers that rest is just a waste of precious time.
It's seen as a weakness.
It is, but for the learner fighting burnout, rest is the glue that holds the entire methodology together. If you implement short, regular sessions and small, achievable goals, rest is the actual mechanism that ensures those strategies convert your effort into memory.
Right, because if I'm using short, focused sessions, I am relying entirely on the break periods, the rest, to do the heavy, complex lifting of information processing and memory consolidation.
Without the rest, the focus session is just cognitive noise.
It doesn't stick.
Not effectively. The expert synthesis in the sources is unwavering. Rest helps the brain grow stronger. It is a non-negotiable biological necessity. It's during sleep and deep rest that the brain engages in synaptic pruning, strengthening the useful neural connections and literally trimming away the weak, unnecessary connections accumulated during the day.
So when learners prioritize the care of your body and mind, meaning adequate sleep, genuine downtime, full mental breaks, the study effort itself becomes profoundly more effective.
Hugely.
So the 6 focused, non-fatigued hours I might log over the course of a week, broken up by dedicated rest and low-pressure activities. That's exponentially more effective than trying to violently cram those same 6 hours into a single, exhausting Saturday session fueled by anxiety and caffeine.
Because you are allowing the neural structures you created during the focused work to solidify and integrate without interference. When we talk about anti-burnout strategies, we're fundamentally talking about respecting biological limits and cooperating with your brain's natural mechanisms.
And if you violate those limits,
The brain refuses to cooperate, and you experience the classic confusing symptoms of burnout. The moment you define rest as a productivity tool, indeed the most essential productivity tool and not a luxury, you unlock sustainable, long-term learning.
it's the difference between beating your head against a wall and simply walking through the open door that rest provides.
And that, at the end of the day, is what turns the learning process from a heavy, punitive grind into a sustainable and even enjoyable journey.
This has been a truly comprehensive deep dive into how to study smarter, not just harder. We've shifted the entire paradigm of effort, really.
I think so.
We started with that universal feeling of stress, and we realized that the solution is structural and psychological. It requires intelligent scheduling and mental self-compassion, not just more willpower.
The fundamental philosophy we've extracted today is that studying should not feel like a punishment. It is a profound journey to be enjoyed. We've shifted the definition of success away from raw hours logged and toward consistent, achievable progress that's lubricated by strategic rest and variety.
And for you, our dedicated learner, we offer 2 essential permissions based on the success stories in these sources. The first one, which alleviates the clock pressure, you do not need to hurry. Mastery is a long game.
And the second, which alleviates the critical pressure, you do not need to be perfect. Perfection is the enemy of progress. Failure is not the opposite of success. It is a necessary pit stop on the road to success.
So the single requirement that remains for sustainable velocity is just consistency. You only need to continue step by step. Continuity over intensity. That's the mandate that prevents burnout.
So let's quickly recap the blend of strategies that fight burnout. First, adopt short, regular sessions to respect your cognitive load. Second, use small goals for that tangible success and crucial motivational fuel.
Third, inject variety into your activities to prevent task monotony. Fourth, strategically leverage that low-pressure, passive input like listening, especially when you are fatigued.
And fifth, embrace imperfection by viewing every mistake as necessary data, all of it supported by mandatory, prioritized rest.
And here is the final provocative thought for you, the learner, as you integrate these ideas into your life. We've established that effective learning requires continuous small steps and a belief in the power of low-pressure input. You are likely tired, or maybe you're procrastinating a difficult task right now. Since the power of passive input is so immediate, what small, 5-minute, low-pressure listening activity related to your subject, not the intense textbook, but an accessible podcast or video, what can you commit to doing right now to prove to yourself that ease and rest can be more powerful than intense, forced effort?
Don't wait until you're stressed or overwhelmed to use these tools. Use ease, variety, and rest as your primary weapons right from the start.
Keep learning, keep resting, and most importantly, keep believing in the power of your own sustainable process.
We'll see you next time for the next deep dive.